Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I see that I'm last to the party this time. Thank you so much for being so prompt as ever. I hope you all had a wonderful lunch, and I hope you all received the track changes versions of the audio checked cuts that you have typed for us over the last day or so. I've spoken to a couple of you already, so I know that you have. Please just do let us know as we go on if you have any questions or points that you need clarified about the changes in those documents. Overall, you guys did a fantastic job. It was not a lot of work for Josie to audio check, and most of the issues were just style and formatting issues. Before we start this afternoon on witness evidence with an interpreter, I'd like to just go over a couple of things in terms of formatting, and it won't take very long because I'm just going to point you to sections in the manual that might help you in terms of shedding a little bit of light on these areas. So the first thing I'd just like to quickly mention is what we do with quotation marks as typists with VGRS. So I'm just going to share my screen again. Here we go. And I'm going to come into the manual. And you may have seen already there's a whole section devoted to quotations in the manual in section 7 at a page 109. And I just wanted to highlight that when we have quotations in the course of proceedings, we always use double quotes, that is double quotation marks, unless we have a quote within a quote. So you can have a look at that in the manual. You can see here, if we come down a little bit to 7.173.4, we can see sometimes we have a quotation within a quotation. The first, I guess the outer portion of the quotation has the double quotation marks, and then the quotation that occurs inside that initial quotation is with single quotation marks. So we can see down here we have an example. The witness said, "I heard the driver scream, 'Watch out for the tree.' That was all that he said." We've got the double on the sort of outside, and we've got the single on the inside. In terms of quotations, I also just wanted to mention what happens when we have really lengthy quoted material. Now, there's a section for this as well. We can see here that under quotations, when we have a really, really lengthy quotation, we are obviously going to be paragraphing in there. So what we generally do is, and I'll just come over to my blank Word document, we would put a quotation mark at the start. We'd have all of that quote there, all of that quote, la, la, la. And then when it comes time to do a new paragraph, we would have a quotation mark at the start of the new paragraph as it continues. Sorry, this looks really messy. And then we'd only close the quotation at the very, very end. So you can see here that we have a quotation mark at the start of each new paragraph, but we only close the quotation at the very end of the quotation. So we don't need it between paragraphs. Does that make sense to everyone? Beautiful. Thank you so much. I know it's mean of me to keep asking for one-word responses when you're all on mute, so thank you for bearing with me on that one. The other thing that I want to mention in regards to quotations, because it's a sort of quite niche area of the manual, is what happens when we have an incredibly lengthy quotation. And for this, I would ask you to go to page 111 of the manual. You can see that the section's called Reading Quoted Material. Now, a lot of the time you will, for example, have lawyers quoting long, long pieces of legislation, and this might just be happening in discussion. What we would do in that case, for those of you who haven't come across this before, is that we would use what we call reads. Now, we can only use this in certain scenarios, but what we would do is we would put our quotation marks, the first 3 words of the quote, a space, dot, 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 another space, and then we will put in parentheses the word reads. Another space after that, dot, 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 another space, and the last 3 words. So we can see if we come down here, we have the lawyer speaking, and he says, in Brown and White, and then he gives the citation, the full bench said, in quotation marks, their lordships held, so that's the first three words, then we've got a space, and then dot, 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 and then a space. Then we've got reads in parentheses, which means at this stage, he could have gone on quoting this particular case for, say, 4 minutes. We don't need to transcribe all of that. We just need to have these reads in the middle, then a space, dot, 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 a space, to be granted, and then we have our end of quotation mark quote there. Now, it's very important, though, to remember that we may only use reads in, you can see here, submissions, addresses, and legal argument, when quoting from an exhibit, or when reading from law reports, cited cases, regulations, etc. We cannot use it when a person is representing themselves. So that means, for example, if someone comes to court without a lawyer and they're just representing themselves without the benefit of a lawyer, in that case, we just type everything. And we cannot use it when a jury is present or when a witness is in the witness box, or in any unrevised transcript, for example, a sentence, a judgment, a charge, or a ruling. So I bring up reads for now because it's really good to get your head around while you're thinking about quotation marks in transcript. But just remember, if you ever feel like using reads in the future, make sure to come to page 111 of the manual and make sure that you're using it in the right circumstances. It can be really handy, though, when used in the right circumstances, and will save you a lot of typing. So that's that. I also just wanted to highlight that as you type more and more, you will come across more and more numbers in text, and in particular, lots and lots of dates. I just wanted to draw your attention to the section of the manual that deals with dates, just based on some of the changes that Josie made in the cuts that you guys sent through. It's just really simple points. It's just a matter of a particular style that VGRS prefers. So if you come to page 75 of the manual, there's a whole section on how to correctly format dates. And I just recommend that you had a little look at that one there. Beautiful. Perfect. Just before we leave the manual, this will be new to a couple of you at least. In legal proceedings, sometimes we have special things that go on, particularly in regards to witness evidence. And I just wanted to raise two of them with you now, just so that you know what you're hearing when you come across it in a matter. One of them we already mentioned a little bit earlier this morning, and that is a voir dire. Now, I'm just bringing these up now so that you can find them in the manual and that you're vaguely aware of them. But if you go to, here we go, page 127 of the manual, it gives you a description of what a voir dire is. And just very briefly, they actually give you a false etymology in here, by the way, just in case you're a language nerd like me. They say that a voir dire is derived from the French to see and to say. That's actually incorrect. It's by the Old French, which means to speak the truth. And a voir dire is when witness evidence is given, but it happens in the absence of the jury. So the jury isn't in the courtroom, it's just the judge and the lawyers listening to the evidence generally. And the voir dire always happens after a jury has been chosen for a trial, after they've been impaneled. It's not necessary to remember the ins and outs of it at this stage. I just want you to make a note of where it is in the manual so that you can find it later if you hear it, and also so I can differentiate it from another sort of thing that happens sometimes with witness evidence, and that is a basher hearing. So a basher hearing, we go to page 62 of the manual. We will see that a basher hearing is something that happens prior to a jury being impaneled. So it also happens in the absence of the jury. Again, it's a witness giving evidence just with the judge and the lawyers listening, but it happens before a jury has even been selected. Again, I just bring this up because we're talking about witnesses at the moment, and these are terms that will come up frequently, so I want you to know where to look in the manual. So page 62 for the basher and page 127 for the voir dire. Beautiful. The other thing just on that, because we've been talking so much about macros, we have a macro for the voir dire. We do not have a macro for the basher. So for example, say His Honour decided that they wanted to hold a voir dire. In our Microsoft Word document, at the start of that, or before the start of that evidence, we would come into VGRS Word macros, over here into court events. You might remember before we had a look at this one when we were talking about closed court or in camera. And we would come on over to start voir dire. We press OK, and then it generates that macro for us. Now again, I believe in the merge, this macro means that the voir dire evidence is separated in the transcript, so it will start on a new page, and that's why it's really important to pop it in. As I said, there isn't one for a basher, but when either of these things occur during a matter, I find it really helpful to jump into your matter spreadsheet, say it was this one, and come over here, and a bit like we were talking before, we would generally leave a little note on the spreadsheet saying, for example, voir dire begins, cut J, and then maybe later, if you're the one to type it, you could write voir dire ends, cut S. And that way, everybody who is typing on this matter knows that there is a voir dire going on. And it means the person who's typing the end of it knows to use the end macro. And it's also really handy for the TC because they can make sure during the merge that everything is formatted as it should be for a voir dire. Likewise, I would put a note in the spreadsheet for a basher. So I'd say basher begins at J and ends whenever. Just coming back to our Word document, we've got the start of a voir dire macro. As you might imagine, under court events, there's also a end voir dire macro. Here we go. And once again, nothing for the basher. That's a very, very brief intro. Are there any questions on that at this stage? Not by the looks of things. Wonderful. So that is that there. What I would now like to move on to is talking about what happens when we have witness evidence through an interpreter. Now, just to give you a bit of an idea of how we're going to run, I would like to take us through again today to 3:30, if possible, just running through examples of what to do in the case of an interpreter and having a bit of a look through some transcript. Then my idea for this afternoon is after 3:30, I might email you through some cuts that I would like you to download the footage for and practice typing. I'm going to give you 2 cuts, but please feel free not to complete 2. You can do 1 if you like, you can do a little less than 1, you can do the full 2, whatever you prefer. But I just want to give you the opportunity to do a bit more typing if you want to. You absolutely don't have to feel as though you need to get it done tonight. And these will be practice types with an interpreter. Does that suit everybody in terms of timing, going through until 3:30 on BlueJeans, and then at some stage over the next day or so completing those practice types, either 1 or 2?
That's fine with me.
It's fine with me.
Perfect.
That's fine with me too, but just in case you've forgotten, I won't be available tomorrow.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, Monique, so I don't forget. So thank you very much, Monique and Nicole, for reminding Kat and I about your availability. I had a little chat with Kat just before. That's absolutely no problem at all. We have discovered that because we are recording on BlueJeans, we can record and then give you access to what it is that we've recorded. So what I was thinking was we will record all of tomorrow. Monique, because you're not available for the whole day, if you're able just sometime sort of over Friday, it doesn't necessarily have to be before we start on Friday, but at some stage, if you could listen through to the recordings that we make. And Nicole, I know that you wouldn't be back in the afternoon until about 2:30 or 3. That's absolutely fine. You could feel free to join us again when you're available, and then just watch what you'd missed, you know, that hour or so that you'll miss, or maybe hour and a half at some other stage. Or the other thing that you could do if it's going to be easier for you is, be with us for the morning, and then don't worry about coming back in the afternoon and just watch the whole session. I'll really leave that up to you. But does that sound like something to be working with?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Amazing. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And as I said, tomorrow we're going to be talking about juries. Juries are fiddly, but again, there's only so much for me to explain before you just need to start typing. So don't worry too much. A lot of it will just come with experience as well, and I'll be able to give you some practice tasks for that too. Beautiful. So now I'm going to move on with interpreted evidence. To do this, we're just going to have a look at a finished transcript, if that's okay with you. When I was having a look at this transcript and wondering if I should get you to download some footage, the bits that I want you to look at are so few and far between that I didn't think it was worth downloading the footage. But I can certainly send you through the details later if you want to have a listen. Just before we look at it, I just want to mention to you that, as we mentioned earlier this morning, obviously a lot of the cases that you'll be coming into contact with might have sensitive information in them. And by that, I mean they might be sex matters, for example. You might be listening to witness evidence from a complainant describing something awful that happened to her. And of course, at EPIC, as anywhere else, we really understand that for typists, that can be sometimes, a little bit difficult to sit through and to type. So before we go on, because the matter that we're just going to be scrolling through in a second is a sex matter, I just wanted to mention to you the EAP program. So I don't know if you can see that here. We've got these little signs up around the office. The EAP is a employee assistance program, and what it means is that as an employee of EPIC, you can call them if you're struggling with something that you've had to deal with at work. And as part of this deal, you get a number of free counselling sessions. Now, I actually haven't used this while I've been at EPIC, but in my previous job, I used the EAP, and it's just a really fantastic resource. What I'll do this afternoon is I'll send you through the phone number and also the web address. And I'm also going to do a little bit of research into how it works for those of you who are interstate, because I imagine it won't be any different. I think it'll just be a matter of contacting EAP near you locally. And I know as well that with EAP, sometimes you can do phone counselling, but I'll send all of that through in an email this afternoon. I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that there are supports out there that EPIC has for you if you have any concerns about some of the content that you might be listening to. Does anyone have any questions on that at this stage? Nope. Beautiful. In that case, let's continue on. So in terms of interpreted evidence, we can find the section for this in the manual at page 87. Because interpreted evidence can be a little bit fiddly, personally, whenever I have it, I tend to have my manual open at this section because it's just really handy to make sure that you're remembering everything as you go. Okay. Page 87, excuse me. Oh, and I just realized I'm not sharing my screen. Excuse me, just give me 1 second. There we go. Okay. Beautiful. So this section of the manual is really, really helpful. There we go. Now, typing interpreted evidence, as I said, is fiddly, but it's not a great deal different to typing normal evidence. Really, what generally happens is that if somebody has very, very little English, or English that is so broken that it's going to be hard to get across what they need to get across when they're giving evidence, Generally, the court will organise for an interpreter to interpret their evidence. Sometimes as well, it's also worth mentioning, you get witnesses giving evidence who actually have a very good understanding of English and might even be okay at speaking it, but they might still get the interpreter just because they want to make sure that there is absolutely no ambiguity about what they're saying, and they want to be able to say it in their mother tongue. And the reason that I mention that is because when we're typing witness evidence, a lot of the time you'll find the witness nodding after the lawyer has posed the question in English. And you can see that they've understood the question, but then they do respond through the interpreter and they wait for them to translate for them. So there are a lot of different sections in the manual about interpreters, but I'm going to take us through the very basics. If I open up this matter, which ran a little earlier this year, this was a really interesting one. It was a sex matter and it actually involved 2 interpreters. Actually, interestingly, this complainant had been more or less stalked and blackmailed by the accused person and came to court to give evidence about it. Both the accused man and the witness had their own interpreters. So we had 2 interpreters going. And on this particular day, the complainant gave evidence. Now, I just want to show you what it looks like in the finished transcript. We can see up here that Olazri Asawani Maboy was called and affirmed. That's the complainant or the person about to give evidence. You can see his honours welcomed her, and then after that, we've sworn in the interpreter. So you can see here that we have the macro for the called and affirmed, and then down here we have what looks like a macro for an interpreter. This is one of those cases where the witness then withdrew and there was some chit chat between counsel and the judge. So I'm going to just come further down the page to the point at which the witness returned. There we go. The discussion ends, and here we go again with the witness. Now you can see as we come down here, it just looks like normal witness Q&A format, and it is pretty much. But you might notice up here with this question, we can see through interpreter. And as we go further down, I'm just going to see if there's any examples. No, there aren't any examples of the witness responding directly to a question without waiting for it to be interpreted, because this particular witness did have a fairly low level of English. But I just wanted to show you what that through interpreter looked like before we go through what it means. So takeaway message from here, we can see that in terms of the format, with an interpreter, after the witness and the interpreter have been sworn in, it pretty much looks like normal witness evidence. But there are a few things that we need to be aware of as we go on. So the first thing, I'm just going to get my blank document up again, is how do we swear in an interpreter? Now, if you have a look at the relevant page of the manual, you can see that it tells us when an interpreter is sworn in or affirmed, it's exactly the same process, more or less, as a witness being sworn in or affirmed. The language is just slightly different. So generally, the TIP staff will say something along the lines of, do you absolutely swear that you will interpret this truly and correctly to the best of your abilities, or something along those lines? The way that we put that in the transcript is like we can see here. So we have the name. There we go. Oh, there we go. So we have the name, and it is underlined, a comma, and then affirmed or sworn as interpreter with a colon at the end. Now, the reason that I take particular care to highlight this is we don't actually have a macro for this particular one. So what we would do is we would pop it in manually. So in caps locks, underlined, I would chuck in the interpreter's name. So say this person was called Stefan Zweig, say he's German. That's all underlined. Then a comma. And then, as we can see here, we have affirmed as, affirmed as interpreter with a capital I. and the colon at the end. That's how it's going to look. And if they took an oath instead, then we would have sworn in here. Cool. So that's that. There we go. And it's also really good as well just to remember that this capital is here, because that's something that our TCs tell us is forgotten all of the time. So again, when in doubt, just refer to the manual. Sometimes, as I was talking about before, we have a witness who has a fairly good understanding of English and actually might not wait for an interpreter to finish interpreting a question, for example. So if here we have, for example, Mr. Lawyer asking some questions. Know about the money? Sure. And instead of waiting for Stefan Zweig, the interpreter, to translate that, the witness responds directly in English. For example, yes, I did know about the money. We would put in this notation, direct. Yes, I did know about the money. But say in the next question, the lawyer said, well, did you really understand, or did you really know? And for some reason, the witness hasn't understood what he said, or maybe just for whatever other reason wants to wait for it to be interpreted, and this time waits for the interpreter to translate the question and then responds in their own language, we would then put through interpreter. And I've broken my own rule already, through interpreter with a capital I. Beautiful. So we really only need to put direct and through interpreter when there's been a change from what's happened before. So if, for example, the whole time the questions are being interpreted, the witness is responding in their own language, and then it's being translated by the interpreter, then we don't need to worry about the notation. We just take it as read that it is being interpreted. But if you have a whole bunch of questions that have been interpreted and they've responded in their own language, and then suddenly, for whatever reason, they understand enough of the next question to know what it means and to respond in English, then that's where you would use direct. You would type exactly what it is that they said. And then say the next question after that they don't understand again, and they wait for it to be interpreted and they respond in their own language. To indicate that, you would then use through interpreter. And we can find all of this in the section of the manual. So we can see down here, direct and through interpreter. So if you want to have a bit more of a read there, I would recommend that. Does anyone have any questions on direct and through interpreter just yet? No? Okay, perfect. The other thing that happens sometimes is that, and we can see it's just here, sometimes the interpreter might not necessarily directly translate what someone has said, but they might answer in the third person. So we can see here, if whilst interpreting, the interpreter speaks in the third person, referring to what the witness has answered, for instance, when did the event occur? Interpreter, she says it was in the corridor. Then we use interpreter in the margin to indicate that she's not directly translating or interpreting what's being said. She's putting her own spin on it by saying, oh, this is what she said. That's just a small point there, but an important one. Likewise, if we come down here, we can see sometimes an interpreter might interrupt proceedings to speak to the court directly as themselves. This happened an awful lot in a case that I did a couple of weeks ago, where the interpreter was new and didn't really understand his role and kept breaking the proceedings to say, oh, I've got another question about what it is that I need to do. It was very awkward. In that case, we also need to be using interpreter in the margin to make sure that we understand that the interpreter is speaking as themselves to the court and they're not interpreting what a witness is saying or speaking on behalf of anybody else. The other thing to keep in mind is that every now and again, as we mentioned in our transcript back here, we might actually have two interpreters in a court proceeding. In that case, what we would do is if we were referring to them in the margin, and I'm just scrolling up to find an example, we would refer to them by interpreter and their last name. So you can see up here, we had interpreter Rahmat, and then later we had interpreter Soatanto. There she is, interpreter Soatanto down there. So more than one interpreter. If you're putting their name in the margin, interpreter, and then surname after that. So they're probably the most important points when it comes to interpreting. Are there any questions in particular about interpreted evidence in general? I'm just going to give you a moment to think about it while I get out of my many windows. No, maybe not at this stage. Okay, perfect. Excuse me for just a second while I check where we're up to. I'm actually tempted now to give you a little while to maybe watch through. I know I said before that I would maybe allow you to have a little bit of a read through and a watch after 3:30. But I was just thinking that while we're here, seeing as at this stage you don't seem to have many questions about this, maybe it would be helpful to you just to watch and read through. Is that something that you'd be interested in? Oh, sorry, just say that again.
That was me. I said it sounds good.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Monique. Diane, Nicole, would that be worthwhile for you as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Yep. Perfect. Okay, amazing. What I might just do then is, I think if you're happy to listen through to this particular matter, I think it'll be really interesting to you because there's a lot going on in there. So in fact, this particular evidence is in camera or closed court evidence. We have witnesses being called and affirmed. We have interpreters being sworn in. We have witnesses withdrawing. We have jury events, which we don't have to worry about until tomorrow. We have indistinct voices in the margin that we can't identify. There's just a lot going on, and I think it'll be quite interesting to sort of read through with that. So what I might actually do now is just jump into there. Let me just find where the audio is and then I can direct you to it. This is from a matter in the county court. Oh. From the 18th of May. And in courtroom 8-2. Beautiful. All right, so here's where the files are. If you're able to go into the audio drive, the R drive, go, and then we're going to scroll down to the date, the 18th of the 5th, 2018. Cool. And this happened in courtroom, County Court 8-2. And here are all the files that we can load into the player. Now, having a look. What I might just do is ask you to download that now, and I'm just going to jump into the footage as well and find the exact point at which we are starting. And then I'm actually tempted to give us maybe even to past, to be honest, or even, yeah, until past to give us time to download the audio and have a bit of a read through and watch with the footage. So what I will do is, does anybody have any feedback, just having had a watch, about anything that occurred to them as they were following through in the transcript, anything they weren't sure of, anything that we haven't really covered or clarified well enough so far? Not by the sounds of it? Okay, perfect. There are a couple of things that I just wanted to mention on what you've just watched. The first one is just a small point, and I'm just about to share my screen again so I can demonstrate it to you. Okay. All right, and that is, of course, that when we have witness evidence, as you would have noticed yesterday, but we didn't remark upon, suddenly what you can see is a lot more confined in the footage. So obviously when we have a witness giving evidence in the court, a lot of the time we might only have the witness's face and not be able to see the other people in the courtroom. So not be able to see the judge as we usually would, not be able to see the barristers as we usually would. It's just the witness. And this is particularly true if the witness is in the remote facility, that is the room somewhere else in the court from which they are giving their evidence. So I just wanted to reiterate that, especially for a case like this, where obviously there's sensitive material, it's a closed court, the witness is in the remote facility and she's beaming in via video link, when we are typing, probably all that we're going to be able to see is the witness's face. And of course, it's at that point that our other ways of figuring out who people are become really important to us. So like we've already spoken about, at this point, FTR can be a really handy tool for us. If someone's speaking and we're not sure who it is and we know it's not the witness, we can use our channels on FTR to give us a bit more of an idea. So like we were saying over the last few days, if you hear someone in the background and you think, oh, maybe it's the judge, but I can't really tell, you could come over to FTR and potentially isolate channel 1, which we know is usually the judge. And if you can then hear him really clearly, you probably know that's who's speaking. Likewise, generally speaking, channel 2 is going to be your witness, and channels 3 and 4 are probably going to be the barristers at the bar table. So that's a really good way to do some detective work if you've got no idea who is speaking in the background. Another tool, of course, that we can use if we've just got the witness's face and other people are speaking, we don't know who they are, is our log. So as we've spoken about a fair amount now, if we open up the log for our matter, we can come in and have a look at the particular time. So say I was looking at 12:13, I could come down here, see, oh, well, I don't have a log for 12:13, but between 12:05 and 12:15, it's just the council member Langton cross-examining this particular witness, Miss Marboy. So we know at that point, if the monitor hasn't included anything in the log, then potentially it's still that person that they've indicated is talking in the background, and we don't have to worry. So the logs are also a really good way to figure out who might be talking in the background. Likewise, when all else fails, feel free to ask another typist via Skype. As we've said in the past, other typists, generally speaking, are really, really friendly, and nobody's ever said to me, no, I won't listen to that bit of footage for you. Particularly feel free to utilise the office typists, because we can obviously get footage up a lot more easily and quickly than people at home can. But if you're typing on the same matter as another at-home typist, they should be able to have the footage up and ready to go because they're already working on it. So they might be able to have a little listen and see if they recognise the voice. So that's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to mention that's just relevant to this particular matter is that, of course, as we've said, this witness is in the remote facility. So as you've been listening, you've been hearing the interpreter Soa Tanto, give responses for the witness. Of course, we cannot see the interpreter. She is sitting just off screen in the remote witness facility. Every now and again, they will sit in front of the camera when they're being sworn in or affirmed, but generally speaking, we won't see them, we'll just hear them. So if you're hearing a really distinct voice that isn't the witness who's right there and you have an interpreter, it's a pretty fair bet that it's going to be the interpreter who's speaking. Beautiful. Amazing. While we're here, I just wanted to mention another thing to do with witnesses that we didn't really get to before. But before I do, does anyone have any questions on, say, the remote witness facility, what it means when witnesses are beamed in via video link, any questions in general about interpreters that might have occurred to you during the break? Nope, not by the sounds of it. No worries at all. In that case, I just want to jump back into my Microsoft Word document, and I'm just going to minimize Miss Maboy for a second. So, and I just want to go through another type of witness event macro that we haven't really touched on yet. So to do that, I'm going to, of course, come back into my VGRS ribbon, come to witness events, and have a little look in here. Now, we've already spoken about almost all of these, phases of examination, being sworn or affirmed, the witness withdrawing or being excused, but we haven't really touched on recalled yet. So we use recalled in a different way to the way that we use called. Now, we spoke about called this morning. That's the slightly tricky one, where we might have more than 5 questions between the witness and, say, His Honour before the witness is actually sworn in or affirmed. Recalled is a little easier to understand. We use recalled when a witness's evidence is interrupted and then picks up, for example, on a subsequent day, or in fact after a break. So, for example, say a witness had been giving evidence in the morning and it was coming up to lunchtime, and His Honour said, let's take the lunch break now. Now, at this point, say nothing else happened before the adjournment, say His Honour just said, let's take the lunch break now, stood up and walked out. What we would, of course, first have to do is withdraw the witness, because we know we're coming up to an adjournment. And that was something that we spoke a little bit about yesterday and I think this morning as well. We always withdraw the witness before an adjournment. So we know the lunch one's coming up, so we're going to come up to witness events. We're going to withdraw the witness, not excuse them, because we know they're coming back after lunch. And then at this point, we can use the adjournment macro. So again, in the VGRS Word macros ribbon, we come across to adjournments. We're going to select B, the lunch and adjournment, and press OK. And now we're going to go to lunch. Now, generally what will happen is that's the end of the morning transcript. So generally we'd start on a new page. Okay, so I might just scroll down the page. All right, and say it's 2:15 now, and we're going to come back from the lunch adjournment. To do that, what we're going to have to do is go back into the adjournments macro. We're going to have to click upon resumption, that you might remember from yesterday. This is the macro that we use when coming back from the lunch break, and that's the only time that we use it. So upon resumption, say it's 2:15, we're going to plug that in. Say the judge is, well, for this matter, the judge was Judge LaCava. So I'm going to put in, oh, actually, I think it's lowercase, Judge LaCava, and it's a His Honour, and it gives us that macro, so we're ready to go. But now, the first thing His Honour is going to say is, let's recall that witness. Or sometimes they might just say, you know, let's bring the witness back. And there'll also be a jury at this stage, but we'll learn about that tomorrow, so don't worry too much about that now. For the sake of the argument, we're bringing the witness back in. So I'm going to come back up to witness events, and I'm going to use the recalled witness. Again, I'm going to chuck in the witness's details. And at this point, this is when our little code buttons down here become important. So say before lunchtime, they were in the first phase of examination, that is examination. When we come back after lunch, we resume with that same phase of examination. So what we would do at that point is we would click XN, because that was what was on before lunch, and we're going to press OK. And you can see here, the macro is generated for us. Joe Anthony Bloggs recalled. So just to reiterate, we use recalled when a witness's evidence is interrupted, say for example by a break, by an adjournment, lunch perhaps, or a short adjournment, or even in fact by the end of the day. So we could have exactly the same thing using the recalled macro if we were coming back the day after to continue with the evidence. And it's just really important to remember that when we use recalled, recalled implies that whatever phase of examination we were in is now continuing. So say we came back after lunch, we know that we're in the same phase as examination as before lunch, so examination in chief or just examination, the first phase. And then Mr. Lawyer, his name we put in the margin because it's not in the macro, asks, say, one question. Just one last question. How old are you? And we get an answer, 27. And 27 is written in words because it's at the start of a sentence. There's just a cheeky little numbers point thrown in there for you. Now, let's pretend that at this stage, that's the end of that. And the lawyer says, no more questions, thanks. And His Honour says, yes, Mr. Defence. We know that means His Honour saying, yes, lawyer for the defence, it's your turn to get up and start the cross-examination. What we need to do at that stage then is go back to our VGRS ribbon, come back into witness events, and we need to signify that a new phase of examination has started, the cross-examination. And this time, down here in additional information, we put in the barrister's name, so Mr. Defence. And then, of course, because his name is in the macro, we can then start with the question and nothing in the margin. But what did you mean? You were 27. And this time we've used the numerals because it's not at the start of a sentence and it's above 10. Fantastic. And then we would have the witness's response. So that's just a little bit of a demonstration on how we use recalled, and just reminding us that recalled means we're still in the same phases of examination as before we were interrupted. Does anyone have any questions on that at this point? No, not by the looks of it. Perfectly clear. Amazing.
Sorry, I do have one, if that's all right.
Oh, I love questions, Diane. Thank you.
In the example, the one that we just read through, I did have a couple of little questions I wasn't going to bother you with now, but now that we've sort of just talked about it, I might as well.
Please do.
When the witness was reaffirmed this day, shouldn't she have been recalled and reaffirmed at that stage? Because they didn't go into her examination then, but she was, she did have some examination in chief the day previous, obviously. So she should have been reaffirmed rather than just affirmed, shouldn't she, and recalled rather than called before she was then withdrawn again. And then when she was brought back after being withdrawn for that little interruption, they've just got that she was examined, but should she have been recalled and examined then rather than just examined?
Oh my goodness, these are fantastic questions. Do you mind, just for my own sake, just taking me to the page where that starts in the transcript, just because I
don't? Page 101.
I've just got the PDF here, whereas I think I sent you the, here we go. Yes, with Olazari Asawani, my boy, called and affirmed up the top.
But she was there the previous day, apparently, having some examination in chief. So yes. I understood perhaps, and I know it normally would be not called there, but because they didn't go into the examination before, she was just withdrawn again almost immediately. So should that have been recalled and reaffirmed? And then when she was brought back after the next 2 pages of discussion, they've just got that she was examined then, and they didn't actually recall her at that stage. They've just got.
At this point, I feel bad for giving you this example because you're 100% right. Now, this was a tricky case. I actually typed on some of this, and it was very messy because the judge kept on insisting on re-swearing everybody.
Yep.
Which usually does not happen. So as we've potentially spoken about over the last few days, when it comes to witnesses, they will generally be sworn or affirmed at the start of their evidence. And even if their evidence goes over a couple of days, generally they won't be re-sworn or reaffirmed. Every now and again, the judge will request that the TIP staff just reminds them that they're still sworn and that they still have to tell the truth, but we don't usually reuse the macro. But for memory with this particular case, His Honour insisted on going through the process over several subsequent days. And I believe the reason for that was because we had 2 interpreters, and I think they also had a number of juries for this case. So it got to the point where he was just redoing everything at every point. But you're right in principle. If you have a witness on day 1 of a trial come into the witness box or appear via video link for the first time, you would of course use the sworn and examined macro, or the affirmed and examined macro, and then after that you would use your macros for the different phases of evidence. And then at the end of the day, say they were withdrawn, but then they come back on day 2, then you're exactly right. On day 2, you're going to use the recalled macro. You're not going to bother with examined or reaffirmed or anything like that. Sometimes there are exceptional cases where there's a lot of discussion, for example, between His Honour and the lawyers about why we need to reaffirm them or something like that. Sometimes in that case, I would get in contact with the transcript coordinator via Skype and just say, hey, this weird thing is going on. I think it's going to make most sense if we use a macro again. And then we just let them know that that's what we've done. And the reason that we do that is then if the court sends us back any feedback saying, oh, why did you do this weird thing in the transcript? Then we would know what they were talking about and it wouldn't be complete news to the TC. The other thing that you were talking about just then is on the same day. So we have someone who is affirmed and then examined. Here we go. I'm just coming down the transcript, so just bear with me for a second. Yes, I can see. So on page 101, they've called and affirmed the witness, sworn the interpreter, and then we've had an interruption. That's right. So what's happened at this point is actually that, as you would have seen, His Honour kicked out the official from the Department of Immigration. And so they've withdrawn the witness. She's disappeared via the video link. They've told the jury to leave. And then you can see we have some discussion between that immigration official and the judge. And that continues and continues and continues. Here we go. Then His Honour gets the jury back in. And then on page 105, we bring back in the witness via video link, and they just immediately start the examination in chief. So yes, strictly speaking, probably called should have been used here, recalled should have been used here. But I think probably the typist might have been in correspondence with the TC and said, I think it's going to make most sense if we use this macro that they've used, which is examined. So clearly they've just used the sworn and examined macro and got rid of sworn and kept examined. So that's a really fantastic pickup, Diane. That's true. And I'm sorry that I've given you a complex example, but really what I wanted you to get from this is just what it's like listening to interpreted evidence. So at least...
Sure, that's fine. Sorry, I probably shouldn't have even bothered with that.
No, you should have. You absolutely should have, because things come up with these questions and we do get really complex matters like this. And just while we're down here on page 105 as well, you would have seen too that there was an example of a through interpreter. I think the reason that they've done that there is because they've got her straight over the video link again, and we already know that the interpreter is in there. But we haven't had any sort of discussion with the interpreter before then. So they're just making really clear the fact that the witness is giving her evidence through the interpreter. And as we come down, we can see that almost all the evidence has been given through the interpreter. Beautiful. Now, the typing tasks that I'm going to give you the information for very soon, they're both actually from the day after this in the same matter. And the particular segments that I'd like you to look at, I've chosen because you'll get a chance to use the affirmed and examined macro for the witness. You'll get a chance to do the interpreter affirmed, I'm pretty sure, for at least one of them. We've got some examples of exhibits, and we also have some discussion interrupting the witness giving evidence. So it gives you a bit of a chance to practice. When do I need to put a name in the margin? When can I just use Q&A? What happens if there's an interruption? So, I mean, it may seem like it's quite a lot to sort of deal with when you're listening to it, but really all I want you to do is be able to engage a bit with the manual, see if you can get a few of the things right, and we can give you feedback from there. And I think that's the best way to become comfortable with all of the information that I've given you today. And I've been so heartened because you can already see in the types that we've audio checked that you guys are engaging with the manual really well. And that is fantastic because it will stand you in such good stead as we're going forward. Beautiful. So probably, given that it's 3 o'clock now, I'll just give you one more opportunity. Any more questions on what we've just seen? Or with... Oh, yes, please, Monique.
If a discussion interrupts a witness Q&A, do we have to use a witness withdrew macro there?
Monique, I'm so sorry to do this to you, but I couldn't quite hear that. Are you able to either move a little closer to your microphone or maybe turn the volume up very slightly? I really apologise for that.
I can't turn it up anymore. My microphone seems to be very quiet. But can you hear me now?
Yes, that's a lot
louder. So if a discussion interrupts a witness Q&A, do we need to use any macros, like a withdraw witness macro for that? We do.
That's a fantastic question, and I'm happy to say that the answer is no.
No, okay.
So I'm just going to jump into my Word document again. Generally, or actually I'll jump into the PDF I was just in and just find an example for you. Here we go. Perfect. So you can see on my screen, on this page, we've had Q&A, 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 and right down the bottom here where my cursor is at line 29, His Honour is actually responding to the fact that we're about to have an exhibit, but he's butted in with his 2 cents in any case. And then you can see the lawyers responded to what he said, and then His Honour's kept going, and there's back and forth, back and forth. And as you rightly said, we would class this as discussion that's interrupting the witness Q&A, but we don't need to use any macros or anything to signify the fact that that's going on. Just the fact that we've got the names in the margins allows us to understand as we're reading the transcript that that is what has happened. The only things to be aware of course, are first of all what we discussed this morning in terms of sometimes having to use that to witness in parentheses notation. So for example, if in here, keep coming down, we've got discussion, discussion, discussion. Here we go. Say here with Mr. Fisher, it says, you know, no, if Your Honour marks it at the moment, I'd be grateful. And then say he immediately turned back to the witness and said, now the other question I wanted to ask, in here would be the point at which we would use to witness, to make it clear that we're going back into witness Q&A. But apart from that, we don't need to worry. There's one other exception, and that's when withdrawing the witness might come into play. Every now and again, we'll be having witness Q&A, and then one of the lawyers might say, oh, actually, Your Honour, I'd like to discuss something with you in the absence of the jury and the witness. So again, don't worry too much about the jury at the moment. But what would happen at that point is that the jury would leave the room and the witness would either leave the witness box in the court or the video link would turn off so the witness couldn't see what was going on in court. In that case, if the witness is leaving the jury box, is leaving the witness box, then yes, we would have to withdraw them. So if the interruption happens in the presence of the witness and they're still there in the witness box, no worries, no need to use any macros or anything like that. We just type the discussion as we usually would and then continue on with witness Q&A. But if the discussion interrupts has to happen in the absence of the witness, so they leave the box and they don't listen to the discussion, then we do have to withdraw them. And then when they come back later, we'll recall them again. Does that make sense at this stage? Would you like me to give you an example?
No, that's all good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. That was a really good question. Thank you. Amazing. Anything else that occurred to anyone just while we have this time? We're actually, if you'll believe it, we're actually running a little bit ahead of time today. So we've got time for questions if you have any. Otherwise, that's fine.